differently than the telephone network, and that was packet switching instead of circuit switching. Can I make the assumption everybody in the room knows what packet switching is? I don't need to create a bunch of analogs like electronic postcards and things like that. The trouble is that the traditional telecom world didn't believe that packet switching would work. But the Defense Advanced Research Projects Agency was really interested in doing computer communication, and it had a problem. It was funding about a dozen universities around the country to do research in artificial intelligence and other, things like image understanding, speech understanding, other kinds of heuristic algorithms. And every single year, every one of the universities that was getting funding from ARPA kept saying, we need to have the latest world-class computer from ARPA in order to do world-class research. And even ARPA couldn't afford to buy. We're going to build a network, and you're going to have it made the packet switch, which at the time was called an interface message processor. This was an incredibly successful project. It really worked. People were able to do interactive programming with remote time. We could move programs back and forth. We didn't have to go to other people's universities in order. Very quickly thereafter, the first mailing list was called Sci-Fi Lovers, science fiction lovers. And you'd expect it. We were all a bunch of geeks, and we all read sci-fi. The next one that got started 2 weeks later was something called Yum Yum, which is a restaurant guide to the Palo Alto area near Stanford University. So it's very clear that email had a social element to it. Then we began experimenting. Reliability from the underlying packet switch. But in the packet radio and packet satellite, there was no guarantee that you had end-to-end reliability in those systems. And so if you were going to recover from a packet loss, you had to do an end-to-end host-to-host. So Bob and I got together in 1973 in my lab at Stanford University and started working on the internet problem, and within about 6 months we could come up with our first design, which was later of work on the protocols, the last two of which split the internet protocol off from TCP. And what was important about that is the argument that was used to do the split. We had gotten end-to-end serial TCP, but there were a group of people in the research group who kept saying over and over again, you have to be able to deliver stuff fast, even if it is lossy. So speech was an example of that. You wanted to have a low latency conversation. You know what it's like if there's a big long lag, you step on each other and it's very awkward, and pretty soon you get into over and Roger and all that stuff. So, and also if you're doing things like missile tracking, it's not that you want to know exactly where it was 10 seconds ago. You want to know where is it now, and I don't care about 10 seconds ago. So the idea of rapid delivery, but not necessarily reliable delivery, persuaded us to split off the IP protocol to support UDP, and then to do TCP over IP for serial and highly reliable exchange. So by this time, it's about 1977, and we have both the mobile radio and the packet satellite system functioning. And in November of '77, we actually linked all three of them together, demonstrating that TCP/IP could link different kinds of packet nets together end to end. Now, ironically, In the laboratory about 1.5 miles from my lab at Stanford was at Xerox PARC, Colorado Research Center, where Bob Metcalf and David Boggs and many others whose names you probably know were working on advanced applications for computing and networking, and they invented Ethernet. And so I knew about that protocol, and it didn't have anything, right? It was a wire. It was a coaxial cable. All the recovery from any loss had to happen device to device on an end-to-end basis. It was very consistent with the TCP IP design. So by 1977, we demonstrate 3 networks. By this time, I'm at ARPA as well, running the program for packet radio, packet satellite, and the internet, and network security. And by the time 1982 rolls around, we are ready to turn on the internet. So there was a year-long program to get the TCP protocols implemented on all 400 of the computers of the ARPANET. Packet radio and packet satellite. So on January 1, 1983, we turned on the internet. And it's been running for 30 years ever since.
So, sorry to interrupt. Did you ever think, was there a moment that you embarked on that you said it's going to be connected to 10 billion devices?
Well, no, actually, we thought that 4.3 billion would be a reasonable number. And we designed the addressing space. You know, the rationale, you'll love the naivete of this rationale. We said, okay, how many networks will be built per country? Because we imagined this would be built in each country. And we had just finished building the ARPANET, or at least since 1973. And that was not an inexpensive thing, so we thought maybe there would be 2 networks in each country, sort of to have some competition. And then the question was, how many countries were there? And there wasn't any Google to ask that question of. So we guessed that it was 128, because that was a power of 2. And programmers always say, so 256 networks, and then we thought, okay, so how many computers will there be on each network? Well, the computers we were dealing with in that period of time were big time sharing machines that cost millions of dollars. And we thought, well, maybe the cost would come down and there will be more of them. So we guessed 16 million computers per network, which is 24 bits. So we said, okay, that's a 32-bit address, and that ought to be enough to last for an experiment. And so we picked the 32-bit number. And incredibly, that actually worked all the way until February 2011, when ICANN officially ran out of unused IPv4 address space. There's still some left in the regional internet registries. But in 1996, we realized that we were going to run out. The experiment essentially got loose. I thought what would happen is that we'd demonstrate everything and then we'd build a production version. But the experiment got out into the general public before we could do the production version. So the production internet is IPv6. And we standardized that in 1996, but it was almost impossible to get anybody to implement it. I built it in the MCI backbone at the time that I was a part of the MCI community. But most of the other people said, we haven't run out of V4, so why bother with V6? It's a terrible argument, because in the long run, you are going to run out. You might as well be prepared for it. So one thing that you need to do, anticipating the degree to which you might depend on internet for the businesses that you build, is to get the ISPs here to implement V6 in parallel with V4 and do it right now. Get this over with now before you have to deal with more and more devices that are unable to run both V4 and V6. You have to run dual stack if you really want to be compatible with what's out there today. But V6 is absolutely essential to our future. It also has a nice property that if the other guy wants to go into secure encrypted mode, you're supposed to say yes. I mean, it's a requirement. So that's not true in V4, it's optional, but in V6 it should be a requirement. So if we want to run end-to-end encrypted traffic, which I think many events in the recent past suggest we should do, then this is the protocol to go after. If you're dealing with large numbers of devices, whether it's set-top boxes, mobiles, automobiles, appliances around the house and home and office, then you really want V6 just for scale.
Yes.
That's 128 bits of address, 340 trillion terminations, which is enough to last until I'm dead, and it's somebody else.
You mentioned, wanted to chat about a little later. Questions from exactly about that security and privacy, and you mentioned obviously all the things that power of government to know in our private communications. And it'd be really great to have your thoughts on privacy on the internet and how do we as engineers attack this problem to make communication safe for our users.
So first of all, there is a very strong movement afoot in the Internet Engineering Task Force to reinforce the use of cryptographic methods to increase the level of security and authenticity in the system. One thing that we need to care about is the authentication of devices and people. Usernames and passwords, reusable passwords in particular, are terrible ideas. We do a bad job of picking them, we don't change them often enough. What we need is two-factor authentication. Google offers this freely to all of its users. But we need to, all of us, start addressing that. So if you're going to build a platform that involves identifying users, please use two-factor authentication. I don't care whether it's a little device you plug into USB or it runs on your mobile, something that requires something you know and something you have to increase the authenticity in the system, to resist some of the side effects of phishing attacks, which are the ones that usually grab somebody's reusable password and then invade. And one of the best ways to inhibit that is to use two-factor authentication. So we have work to do here. I want to distinguish between government surveillance and commercial access to private information, because these two need to be looked at differently. If you're a telephone company, the company I used to work for, we had quite a bit of information about when you made a phone call, what number you called from, what number you called, how long did you talk. And that metadata, I think, would be considered by most people to be private information. It was treated that way by the telcos. The problem, of course, is that some governments, American included, the intelligence community and the law enforcement community had the right to demand information under certain conditions, specifically court orders. And without going through all the details, there's been some erosion of the court order part, at least in the U.S. And that's raised a great many concerns. But I think we need to distinguish between governments abusing access to personal information and the private sector having access to and potentially abusing personal information. I don't think those two are the same. They don't pose the same kind of threat. In the case of the commercial world, the important thing is that companies recognize when they have personal information or private information and take steps to protect it and take steps to make sure that the users know what information is it that's being accumulated and for what purpose. So Google has worked very hard to create a dashboard to help people know what information is accumulated and what we do with it. We still have work to do there. I think we need to make it even more transparent than it is today. We also, working on the other side of it, have been publishing what we call a transparency report, so people can see what governments around the world have, what demands governments around the world have made of Google about personal information. And so we're trying very hard to make this as transparent as possible. But it's still a work in progress. The thing I also want to emphasize, though, is that we are our own worst enemies when it comes to the loss of privacy in the internet. To give you a simple example, let's imagine that if you have gone to, let's say you've gone to Egypt, or maybe right now might not be a good idea, but let's imagine at some point you did that, and you're standing in front of the pyramids, and you'd like to have a photograph of yourself in front of the pyramids. So you ask somebody that you don't know to take a picture. And I just happen to be near enough to be caught in the image. Okay, fine. So you upload this. You don't know who I am. You don't know who the picture taker is. You upload the image. And somebody else is crawling around looking for pictures of pyramids, and they find your picture. And they see me, and they happen to know who I am. And so they tag me. Okay, so now somebody else who's crawling around looking for pictures of Vint Cerf discovers a picture of me standing in front of the pyramids next to you at a certain date and time. Except I had told them that I was somewhere else at the time. So now I'm in trouble because of a picture that you asked somebody to take and you posted. Now this is, a made-up example. The reason it's important for you to think about, though, is that this is an example of an innocent set of actions which led to a problem for me, which you didn't intend. Our intuitions about the social effects of our use of our technologies is still immature. Now, I am, let me say, optimistic that we will evolve social conventions for dealing with this, as we have in other situations. There are things that you just don't do in public, for example, or you don't do face-to-face and what have you, because it's just considered socially inappropriate. Some people still do those things, and either we think of them as jerks, or sometimes we actually think of them as lawbreakers, because I'm sorry, you can't do that in public. There will be consequences. So we adopt social conventions for convenience. And to show you a very trivial example, when you're walking down the street, opposite somebody else, usually in most cultures you just get out of the way. You can imagine a kind of silly practice where you stand in front of each other and you dare the other person to get out of the way first. We don't do that because it's inconvenient. So social conventions to make life a little more fluid and comfortable are not uncommon. It's just that we haven't evolved them yet for the online environment. And that's a task that we all face.
We have a lot of entrepreneurs in the room that use it to build businesses, and we are in South Africa, the continent of Africa. Internet has had a huge impact on the continent, but I think we're all a little bit disappointed in the growth of internet in Africa, and I want to have your thoughts about what do you think about the role of private industry, about government. You said earlier, ARPANET would never have happened without the support of the DoD and the US. So how do you feel about what can we do here? How can we increase the speed of adoption of internet in Africa?
So you've asked the question that has just an enormous number of facets to it. Let me try to go through a few of them. The first one is that government investment in research is actually very important. For one thing, governments can tax. They can assemble a fairly substantial amount of money, and they get to decide how to spend it. Sometimes we don't agree with what they've chosen, but what's important is that if you have a really hard research problem that no business would ever go after because it's too risky, the government can actually afford to do that. And that's what ARPA does. And it's not the only agency in the United States that does this. The National Science Foundation, Department of Energy, NASA, and so on, all have R&D programs. And they are all frequently aimed at pretty hard problems. The government can afford to continue to support research if it appears to be productive. The networking research support from ARPA went from 1969 to 1990. The research support from the National Science Foundation went from approximately 1982 to 1995. These are long-term investments. The thing that was really important is that the results of the investment were very, very rapidly translated into the academic sector because a lot of the research was being done by academics. So people moving through universities who were interested in this stuff actually got trained in the early stages of internet development to figure out how to build a router, how to write a TCP end-to-end, how to build applications on top of all that. Then they moved out into industry. And I remember around 1992, there were people graduating from universities in the United States who had access to email from NSF in particular. And they would get into the companies and they would say, "Where's my email?" And of course, there wasn't any. And the companies were forced to adopt email because their new hires were saying, "I want my email. I can't do my work without being able to interact with my colleagues." So people started putting email addresses on their business cards and would apologize in 1992 if they didn't have an email address on their business card. So this ability to transfer technology is very, very important. And it happens, the word technology transfer is an oxymoron. Technology does not transfer itself. What transfers are products that people can use and people. And the basic engine for technology transfer in the world I've lived in has been people going from the research environment into business. And sometimes we have this happen inside of our own company where somebody who has invented something ends up being responsible for turning it into a product and then turning it into a business. So that part's really important. Now I want to pick off a few specific things traps that we need to be aware of. In Sweden, the last figure I heard was that 4.4% of their GDP goes into R&D. This is a really big percentage. The question is, what has happened? And when I was visiting there, we were asking ourselves, well, are there a lot of small and medium-sized businesses started in Sweden? The answer is yes. And a lot of them get started because of R&D that happened in either an academic setting or R&D from some corporate setting. The question is, how many of those startups grew? And the answer is not very many. They didn't have Ericsson's and Saab's and other kinds of really big businesses growing out of all these little startups. They had lots of startups, they had some big businesses, but not a steady growth of small business to big. So the question was, why is that? All that R&D, all the innovation and everything else was there, good quality people coming out of, well-educated people out of universities. So when we bored into this, we discovered a reason, not necessarily the only one, that there was a problem. It turns out in Sweden, if you start a company and you are the CEO and the company fails, you are personally liable for the debts of the company. Now, most CEOs tend to be very conservative when it comes to investments because they don't want to lose their personal wealth in consequence of a corporate failure. Now, I believe that needs to change. I hope the Swedish government creates the kind of limited liability arrangement that is common elsewhere. So that's an important lesson to learn, that you need to have the right ecosystem with the right parameters in place in order to make R&D and innovation turn into business. And that's an example of a case that didn't happen. Now there's another problem that shows up that's related to this. Every once in a while, we will have visitors coming to the Silicon Valley saying, I want to turn X, for some value of X, into Silicon Valley. And one day, several years ago, Tony Blair, while he was still Prime Minister, showed up. And John Chambers, the CEO of Cisco, invited about 10 of us to come and have lunch with the Prime Minister. And first, after Tony talked about the importance of education, which I hope we all agree with, and maybe we'll come back to that. Then he asked the question, how do I turn London into Silicon Valley? And there was dead silence. And I'm sitting there feeling really embarrassed because, oh my God, the Prime Minister just asked a question. You can't just sit there. So I said, well, maybe we could explain to the Prime Minister what it was about the Silicon Valley environment that enabled us to be successful. And so Steve Jobs raised his hand. And which is unusual. Steve normally would bother raising his hand, but he raised his hand. And so I called him Steve, and he said, well, one thing we all have in common here is that we've all failed at one time or another. I'm sure he was thinking about Next, which is, a brave but not totally successful business, except he sold it to Apple, and that worked out really well. And his point was that it didn't leave him with the mark of Cain on his forehead. He was still, that was considered a mark of experience in the Silicon Valley. Now, if you fail all the time, that's a different story. But the idea that failure is experience is incredibly important. I can't emphasize this enough. The first business that you start may not succeed, but you've got to learn something from that if it doesn't. Don't keep making the same mistakes. Esther Dyson says, keep making different mistakes. That's good advice. So the idea that a business failure is a learning experience is actually important. And in the Silicon Valley, it's treated as, it's important to know how things can fail, how you can detect that you might be on the wrong road, how you might actually be able to respond to that. So experience is really, really important. So I don't want you, as you have aspirations to start new businesses, to be discouraged if the first business doesn't work. Now the problem here is that the other parts of the environment, the ecosystem, including funding, has to also have the same attitude, because if they see your business has failed, then they don't want to lend you any more money, because obviously you don't know how to run a business. And even if that might have been true, it's not necessarily true that you don't know how to run the next one. So it's really important to get the venture capital funding apparatus tolerant of failures in the face of treating that as experience. And this is an area where I'm pretty sure that South Africa needs some work. The same is true, by the way, in Europe. They have exactly the same problem.
So, I mean, that's something that comes up quite often. We have, people talk about Silicon Cape and trying to reproduce the success here in Silicon Valley. The same thing, obviously, with a place like Jozihub. How do we go about building more of that sense of experimentation? I mean, I think that's a big challenge we have in the culture of entrepreneurship in South Africa, maybe less so in some other African countries, and maybe you have some thoughts about how we increase that sense of being okay with failure, at least experimentation, and learning out of that.
So yesterday at Big Tent, we had a young man who had started 3 businesses and failed, and then he did Tax 10, which is, as near as I can tell, a very successful, nearly break-even now business. So those 3 failures first didn't stop him. And second, people believed in him enough to give him funding for the next step for business. So persistence and patience really count here. But if you don't have infinite bucks in your pocket, the patience has to be augmented with somebody else who believes in you and is willing to help fund you. So you need venture capital, you need angel investors. And as far as getting the attitude about failure to change, I think you need more stories about people who have tried and not succeeded and then had a big success. How many people have tried to submit a book, manuscript to many different publishers, only to finally get somebody at the end? There's a famous book in America called Gone with the Wind. It turned into a massive thing, movies and everything else. The woman who wrote that book had 39 rejections. Now, how about J.K. Rowling and Harry Potter? A whole string of rejections until National Scholastic, an educational K-12 educational publishing company, which had a very modest business, accepted the manuscript, and the world changed, right? So my view is patience and persistence. Don't take no for an answer.
So you mentioned yesterday a little bit about spectrum, and I thought it'd be a really interesting discussion, especially about your comments about the role of government, and also this whole idea of having more competition in the market. So I'd like to maybe talk a little bit about spectrum and the whole idea of utilizing network capacity and the regulation around that.
Okay, so first of all, people run around saying there is a dearth of spectrum. That's baloney. It turns out the spectrum keeps going, all the way up to terahertz and petahertz and whatever, petahertz frequencies, although we don't know how to generate some of those frequencies yet. Although we can actually get to 60 gigahertz now. The thing is, if you go out in the field and you hold up a radiometer and you analyze how much of the spectrum is in use at any one moment, it's about 2%. Now, what that means is that we are dedicating capacity to people who don't use it very much. And the reason that we are dedicating capacity and giving clear channel access to a lot of users is that we're still operating with a 1916 radio mindset. That's where the regulations sort of came from. In the US, I think it starts around 1912. And the idea there was we didn't understand how crappy our receivers were back then, but they were so bad that any noise that radiated into any frequency would somehow pollute the signal. And so we wanted to say, well, we'll fully dedicate frequency in narrow slots to particular uses of a radio channel. And we persisted in that way of allocating. Our spectrum options, for example, allow a winner to get dedicated access to capacity who then doesn't use it very well. So this notion of dedication is a consequence of an ancient and crappy technology that's long been superseded with very sophisticated digital transceiver capabilities. So an example, a company called Qualcomm, which has been very successful in the mobile business, uses code division multiple access in order to allow simultaneous transmissions in the same spectrum to be disentangled by the receivers. And that's just one example. You can do phase shifting, you can do polarity, you can do a whole bunch of other, almost 5 different things you can do to a radio transmission in order to distinguish one from another. Mm-hmm. And it's important to recognize that we at Google have been big fans of the TV white spaces on the grounds that those are spaces that have not been used at all, either guard bands and things like that. Again, that consequence of crappy receivers. The receivers we can build today very cheaply are not crappy, they're actually very smart. So what I would like to see is a real change, a sea change in regulatory attitude about spectral allocation. I'd like to see spectrum being made available on the grounds that you will design and build receiving systems that are able to distinguish and disentangle signals. And you don't get it unless you're willing to commit to multiple occupancy in that frequency band. The other thing we've learned from packet switching is that if you allocate a big chunk of spectrum and you allow people to share it, it's far more efficient than slicing it up into narrow pieces. That's why big fat channels that people use for packet switching produce so much better results than a bunch of little narrowband channels. For one thing, the faster they go, the lower the latency. Until you're getting really close to speed of light latency because the routing system is just pushing stuff through packet. Packet transmission delays are practically zero as a result. So it's just propagation delay that becomes the gating factor. So large channels that are shared using sophisticated radio technology, or for that matter, sophisticated optical technology, should be the way we go forward. And we need to have some successful demonstrations of that. We've been experimenting, as you know, with TV white spaces here in the U.S. and elsewhere. And I'd love to see more and more of that adopted as a standard practice.
But the current model really at the moment is still to sell off blocks of spectrum, and in return for monopoly,
right,
to then expect to grow.
So there are two issues here. One is the monopoly carrier getting the benefit from buying a chunk of spectrum. This is, frankly, it's not stupid from the monopoly winner point of view, but it's stupid from the government point of view. If you want to make money out of spectrum, don't sell it. Make it available for sharing. Look at what happened with Wi-Fi. Open access spectrum. I have no idea what the total number of dollars are, or rands are, in Wi-Fi products and services, but it's big. And it's a consequence of lots of people getting access to the same spectrum without licensing, other than staying within certain levels of emitted energy. So what we should be doing is making spectrum available, allow it for sharing. And where will the money come from? It comes from taxing successful businesses that make profit. And that's the outcome you want. What you want is successful businesses that take advantage of the spectrum, not a single monopoly supplier. Now, if I've offended somebody, it was on purpose.
That's great. I mean, since we're talking about offending people, maybe talking a little bit about net neutrality. And we had a little bit of chat about that. And, I mean, usually we talk about net neutrality in the sense of traffic shaping or hindering access. But in Africa, you can also see the flip side of that, where you're using that same mechanism to subsidize access for people that are poor. So it's not always the negative. Well, that's maybe my question to you is, how do you see that? And do you think, on the one side, choking torrents to make access cheaper for other people, does that violate net neutrality?
So, first of all, net neutrality was an issue that arose in the United States first. The then head of AT&T complained that Google and others were stealing their bandwidth, right, because they weren't paying for it. And I'm sitting here saying, well, excuse me, sir, you don't really understand what the internet business model is, do you? And he didn't say, no, he didn't say anything. The thing is that the telephone model was you make a phone call and you pay if you call. So you pay for everything in between, source to destination. The internet model is you pay to get onto the internet, to an internet service provider, and once you pay to be on the internet, you should have the freedom to interact with anybody on the internet that you want to, using any application that you want to, I mean, assuming it's legal. And that's it. And what goes on in between is the business of the internet service providers, maybe the tier one, backbone providers. They figure out what the terms and conditions are for interconnection. I often show big pictures of the internet and how it's all interconnected. It looks like a giant blob with literally hundreds of thousands of networks, all interconnected. Nobody dictates who they interconnect with. They choose based on economic need and utility, but they all are focused on one thing. If I get a packet from a customer, I have to be able to deliver it to every possible destination on the internet. That's the job of being an internet service provider. So the idea here is you pay to get on and you do what you want. That is not the model that telcos have typically dealt with. So net neutrality, from my point of view, had only to do with anti-competitive business practices. What that means is if you're the supplier of broadband access to the internet, then you cannot use that control of that access to interfere with other people's applications, even if they compete with your own. So a trivial example of this is suppose you're a cable television provider who also provides internet service. And it turns out that somebody else other than you is delivering video through the internet part of that access, competing with your video services.
Or voice services.
Or voice, yes. I mean, any of these things, yes. So net neutrality says you can't interfere with the other guy's traffic for purposes of anti-competitive purposes. That's all it says. It doesn't say every packet has to be treated the same. It doesn't say you can't charge more for more usage. It just says you can't interfere with somebody else's services just because you happen to have control of the underlying broadband channel. And we have a situation in America where the Federal Communications Commission has tried to enforce that kind of network neutrality and has gotten into legal trouble because its current legislative footing isn't quite adequate to allow it to do what I think it needs to do and should do. Now, some people will say, well, what about providing low latency service in preference to higher bandwidth service? So file transfer over here, which doesn't need low latency, but Twitch games and interactive stuff and video and audio needs lower latency, and so we need to specialize the service or treat them differently. That's okay, as long as everybody's low latency traffic gets treated that way. Not, this guy paid me extra money for low latency service and you didn't, so you're not going to get low latency service and he does. Sorry, it doesn't cut it. If it's low latency service that's needed by that particular brand of traffic, everybody should get that treatment. That's network neutrality.
So, off to another place where there's no regulation, interplanetary internet. We know that you've been working with Jeff Paulson Laboratory and thinking about how does IP work in space. I'd really love for you to talk to us a little bit around, does it work, and what are the modifications that you guys propose to make that work, and what does the future of the internet look like in space?
So this is actually amusing. We just, by the way, Google just had its 15th birthday on the 5th of September. And about that time, I was starting to work with the Jet Propulsion Laboratory and the team there on the design of an interplanetary internet. And the reason we got there is that the year before, in 1997, we saw the successful landing of the Pathfinder. It was a small robot about this big, landed on Mars, roamed around, sent some unbelievably spectacular pictures back. And it was delivered by a very interesting, entry landing system. It was a big balloon, and it bounced around for a while, and then opened up, and the thing crawls out. It's still functional, which is amazing. I mean, if somebody walked into my office and said, "This is how we're going to deliver your $3 million space vehicle," I'd throw them out of the office. So it shows you how much I know. So anyway, we saw that happen, and we knew that there were going to be subsequent missions to Mars planned. And we said, well, how the hell are they going to communicate? And the answer was supposed to be a direct radio channel from the surface of Mars back to the Deep Space Network, which has big 70-meter dishes in Madrid, in Canberra, Australia, and Goldstone, California. So we got to thinking about that, and we said, we ought to have a richer networking environment for space exploration than point-to-point radio channels. And we said, well, Internet's a pretty good example of a rich networking environment. It works on Earth, so it ought to work on Mars, right? And we persuaded ourselves that it could work on Mars. And then we started thinking about, what would TCP/IP do if it were running between Earth and Mars? Okay, so you start doing math. How far apart are we? Well, when we're closest together in our orbits, it's 35 million miles. It takes 3.5 minutes for a radio signal to go from Earth to Mars at the speed of light. You got another 3.5 minutes to come back. This is not exactly interactive, that's 7 minutes. What about the 20-minute time it takes when we're farthest apart in our orbits, 235 million miles, do the math. 20 minutes one way, 40 minutes round trip time. You know how TCP flow control works, right? You run out of room and you say stop. And if the other guy hears this in a couple hundred milliseconds, it works great. You do a little buffering all the time. If it takes 20 minutes before he hears you say stop, he's transmitting at full speed, and packets are falling all over everywhere. Doesn't work. Then there's this other problem. It's planetary rotation. We haven't figured out how to stop that. So if you're sitting on the surface, of Mars, and the planet's rotating, and you're talking to the spacecraft, eventually you can't talk to it anymore because there's a planet in between. So we said, all right, this is variable delay and disrupted communication, and TCP is not really well suited to that. So we said, all right, let's start over again. Let's think about what the protocols would have, what parameters and features the protocol would have to have. So we developed a whole new suite of protocols that are part of what's called delay and disruption tolerant networking. The Advanced Research Projects Agency actually funded some of this work. And we said, this would be really helpful in tactical communications because you do get disrupted. Any of you using a mobile here and anywhere actually know that you don't always get good connectivity. So there's disruption just like we have in the interplanetary situation. So we developed the protocols. We went through 4 iterations of them, kind of like TCP/IP. We now have them running on ground equipment here on Earth. in the International Space Station, in the orbiters around Mars, and on the rovers, including the Mars Science Laboratory, and on a spacecraft called Epoxy that's in orbit around the Sun. Epoxy has visited 2 comets in the last 10 years' time. So we have a nascent interplanetary backbone in operation. We're standardizing this protocol with the Consultative Committee on Space Data Systems, which is a UN organ where the spacefaring countries of the world agree on standards. If they adopt the standards, when every nation, any nation, launches a new spacecraft that can use these protocols, then we can repurpose that spacecraft when it's done with its primary scientific mission to become a node in an interplanetary backbone. So we hope over time, over the rest of the decades of this century, that we will literally grow an interplanetary backbone in order to support both manned and robotic space exploration. The standardization is just like being able to plug into the internet and talk to 2 billion devices out there. Should I go on?
No.
One other time. And this is not the end. Okay, that's sort of it sets the stage for the next big plan. ARPA released a research grant to a consortium to design and not build, but to design a spacecraft to get to the nearest star in 100 years' time. Now, the nearest star is Alpha Centauri. It's 4.4 light years away. And right now, with the current propulsion systems available, it would take 65,000 years to get to Alpha Centauri. This is a little long even for an ARPA project. It's only 6 times longer than our entire civilization has existed. So one of the big challenges is creating a propulsion system that can get to the nearest star in 100 years. Right now, probably ion propulsion with enough payload on board to keep the propulsion engine going for 100 years. At the 50-year mark, when you hope you're halfway to the destination, you kind of flip over to slow down, because otherwise you go zipping through the Andromeda system at 20% the speed of light, you get 1 picture and that's it. So we want to slow down and go into orbit and stay there for a while. So that's the propulsion problem. There's a navigation problem, because normally what you do when you're doing interplanetary navigation is that you send a signal to the spacecraft in mid-course to make any corrections that are needed in order to make sure it gets to the destination with the proper speed and time. Well, you know, it's okay if that mid-course correction interaction has a few minutes of round-trip time delay, or tens of minutes even. But imagine you have a spacecraft a light year away. So it takes a year to send the signal to get there to say do something different, and it takes a year to find out what happened. So this is not exactly interactive. The conclusion we reached is we need to autonomously navigate, and that's probably okay because we know about the basic proper motion of the stars within about 10 light years of Earth. And you can use stars that are much farther away, you know, tens of thousands of light years away, because their apparent location will not change if you move a few light years from Earth. So you use them for orientation, and then you navigate your way based on knowledge that you have on board. So it's an autonomous navigation problem. This is good. We don't have to do that 2-year round trip time thing. Then the last problem is signaling. How do we generate a signal in a spacecraft that's 4 light years away that we can detect here on Earth? And right now, a common thought is to use femtosecond lasers. This is a laser that can compress, say, 100 watts worth of power into minus 15 seconds. This is a really big pulse. And it's something we should be able to detect from 4 light years away. There is a little problem, however. Even if it's a nice collimated laser beam, the thing is going to beam spread over the course of 4 light years. It'll be about as wide as the solar system, which means it's a very attenuated signal. The way you typically respond to a problem like that is to build a synthetic aperture receiver. So I need the interplanetary backbone to build a synthetic aperture receiver to pick up the signal and reintegrate that signal back so I get enough power to actually interpret the data that's coming back. Now, one of the physicists in the room said that there might be another interesting alternative. He reminded us that gravity bends light. That's how we demonstrated that Einstein's theory of space distortion due to gravity was correct, because there was an eclipse of the sun, and I don't remember the year, but I think it was 1916. But in any case, during this eclipse of the sun, a particular star's position shifted, and we could see that because of the eclipse. And that shift was predicted by Einstein's theory. So this confirmed that there was a bending of light by gravity. Well, the consequence of that is that if you go 550 astronomical units away from the sun, which is about 55 billion miles, you are in the focal point of the sun's gravity lens. So if we could get a spacecraft to go 55 billion miles away and sort of park, that's not an exact analogy, but let's pretend, park at that lens location, we could possibly reintegrate the light coming back from the femtosecond laser in the Andromeda system, so we could actually detect it.
Mm-hmm.
So that's the latest plan for the interstellar system. And there's something personally delicious about all this, because the guy that started us thinking about computer networking in applications that are not just computational, things like artificial intelligence and knowledge engineering and things like that, is a man named J.C.R. Lichtleiter, who was at MIT. And he wrote a note to his colleagues referring to the intergalactic network that he had in mind. Of course, this was all tongue-in-cheek, but he was referring to something which eventually became the ARPANET project. And because we all remember that in my community, when we developed the interplanetary protocols, we made the transport protocol called the Lichtleiter Transport Protocol, or LTP, in commemoration of his intergalactic ambition. Unfortunately, we're only able to do interstellar. Intergalactic is for the next generation.
Right. Before we ask questions, we kind of run out of time, and we've got some questions from the audience. But you mentioned over lunch something really interesting, that you were here. You're not a stranger to South Africa. You were here in 1974 to connect a node of the ARPANET in South Africa. I don't know if you guys knew that. And we've got somebody in the audience who was involved in that. And maybe you could just, as a last point.
Is Gareth flying around somewhere? Can I see a hand up? There's Gareth. Okay. I just destroyed something here. You're listening to my stomach rumble. Okay, I'm going to tell a story about Gareth. And then I'm going to ask you to say something, so you should be prepared to come up here and use the microphone. Did I destroy the microphone? Well, I'll attach it to my microphone. I don't even know how to say it. Okay, so here we go. Here's the story. It's 1974. The ARPANET has been in operation for 5 years, since 1969. And there's a Technical Committee 6, which is part of the it was IFIP, thank you very much, the International Federation of Information Processing. So this technical committee, which has just been started just a couple of years before, decides that it wants to meet here in Joburg, and it's going to demonstrate the ARPANET from here. Now, this is kind of early on to do that. Gareth was working at the South African Railway at the time as an engineer, and we needed him to try to get the telco and the regulator to allow us to attach an acoustic coupler to the telephone network. And he says, you're going to attach that to our networks? You must be crazy. And maybe we were. But anyway, Gareth went off to help us make that happen. And so we demonstrated the ARPANET here 40 years ago. And the thing that I want to emphasize to you is that there was a small group of people who participated in that activity from Joburg who saw the 40 years into the future, in some sense, in that demo. And I had always hoped that this would trigger some serious thinking and evolution of networking in this country. And frankly, for a period of time, the academic networking community was very advanced and became the backbone for some of the academic networking in countries to the north as well. But I want Gareth to come up and talk about the consequences of his interacting with the people in the regulatory agencies and the telcos. So Gareth, can I ask you to come up and join us? I need a life lesson here. This is very important. Gareth was just an engineer at the South African Railways at the time. Didn't get to see him again until 1992. Keep all your friends. You never know when they're going to end up in an absolutely fabulous environment. Do you want to come up here where we can get you on camera?
I'm on camera already.
No, are you already on camera? No, come on. Must be something.
Listen,
Okay.
we're both members of the Broken Switch.
That's right.
That proves we haven't deviated
Okay.
from our course.
Do you want to sit down?
No,
here?
not at all,
No, we'll
not
be
at
on
all.
camera. All right. So what happened?
Listen, first of all, it's wonderful for me as a person, and Koos Koen, who was sitting next to me, to see Vint. We met up, right. And the gentleman that gave the demonstration was a guy called Bob Metcalf, who you know very well from the Ethernet. And he Now, I don't know whether you read the papers last year. Then he was 90 years old, and he was taken to court for all the things he did wrong. He said, well, this is not really interesting. Let's do it. The computer comes immediately. Brighton, next to the railway line. Thabo and Becky got his masters in economics there. Varsity Hall. Gentlemen, your station has just been closed. There has been a bomb explosion. That was the first bomb the IRA blew up in Britain. Now, when I saw that, it went with a hammer between my two eyes. Because suddenly you realize, what? This is the future. This is the way it's going to be. We don't understand this yet. So the next year, the whole lot came, went into the whole 3C6 committee. Went to the Carlton Hotel, we had a symposium. Those of you who are interested, I've still got all the documents. Fascinating. But what the situation was in South Africa at that stage, very important. There was a telephone, or rather a postkantoor, post office, and telecommunications, one organization. All right? Secondly, they had the network, telecom network in the country. The railway had its own network for obvious reasons. So we had a knowledge of telecom networks. And the fascinating side was that the telecom people today were very jealous of not allowing anybody else to share a line or whatever it might be.
Amen, brother.
So,
What's changed?
yeah, well, only the two of us. Anyway.
Speak for yourself.
Of course. What are you doing? Anyway, the fun of it is that they didn't want. Now, networks was trying to develop. If you wanted to join with somebody else on the network and share, illegal. No third-party traffic was allowed on any line that you were renting or hiring. And what we did is we used this demonstration special demonstration in a separate little room, and we got in a guy that he was the guy who changed the railway from a state organization to a company. We won't talk about the present Transnet at this stage. But he had a friend who was Dr. Boyce. And Dr. Boyce was the head of the post office, and an open-headed kind of a guy. And we demonstrated to him privately, Vint was there, I was there, Koos was there, and the two gentlemen. And we told him what the future was going to look like 40 years from now. And that led to the so that data network to share still run on normal standard post office lines. Thank you very much. Enjoy.
So we're very close to the. We've got about 2 or 3 minutes left, and I really want to take one question from the 1 or 2 questions from the audience, and the top one is very topical, obviously, at the moment. Editor of The Guardian recently wrote a journalist would have to return to face-to-face meetings rather than electronic comms. How does this make you feel, both personally and as an inventor of the internet architecture? And I think that's interesting for us as engineers. How when you talk about norms, but if we start worrying that people don't use electronic communication anymore.
Now is this thing?
Yeah.
Okay. So first of all, this is a really serious issue, and it needs to have a serious response. As engineers, I think we have a responsibility to let people protect their privacy. End-to-end security that it's never going to be absolutely guaranteed nobody can ever break in. But I can tell you that we're looking at 2,000-bit keys now instead of 24-bit keys in order to protect the communications that we support in our system. We should be building software and hardware that will protect security. Here's an example. We want hardware to mutually reinforce the software security. I'll give you an example of this. When you turn on your computer, there's a little BIOS program that gets executed, and it downloads the operating system. The current designs now allow for you to digitally sign the bootstrap program, and the hardware will check to see if the digital signature is correct. It won't run the BIOS if it doesn't check out. If you're going to update the BIOS, which happens from time to time, the updated version had better have a successful digital signature, or the update won't happen. The hardware is reinforcing that. There are other things that we can do. We don't have time to go into detail. We use hardware to reinforce the basic software idea. That, plus the potential for designing trusted computing modules, should allow us to build much, much more secure systems that are far more resistant to the kinds of attacks that take place today. And we owe it to ourselves and to the people that use our systems and your applications to build in as much security as we can. That's why I want everyone to move away from reusable passwords to two-factor authentication. You need to help people understand how much risk they are at and how to defend against that. So this is the time, in a very funny way, in the midst of all this stuff, there is a galvanizing opportunity here to align ourselves in the direction of protecting privacy. And I think that's the job we have ahead of us, and I'm committed to it personally.
Past, but also the future of the internet. I really appreciate it.
Always a pleasure. I hope to come back.